It's not a clown car, it's a Beechcraft Baron. There are 6 seats inside. Most people would assume that means enough room for 6 occupants. If you had any questions about it, it's in the airplane flight manual as well. And if that isn't enough, the regulations go even further. Just like a car, you need a seatbelt for each person. Common sense, aircraft manual, federal regulations. We all push the boundaries sometimes. Maybe it's because convenience is easy to measure. It's always right in front of us. Safety, on the other hand, is neck-deep in probabilistic ooze. You can get away with a great number of things many times without tragedy. There were 7 people on board when the plane disintegrated in the trees at 11 a.m. When the pilot filed the flight plan, he quickly confessed to having one more person than the aircraft had seats. The Burlington Flight Service Station representative responded, "I thought the Baron only carried 6. The pilot explained, "Well, we got some kids with us today." The flight departed from Keene, New Hampshire. It's about as far from Boston as the Hamptons are from New York City. The destination was Charleston, West Virginia, a 504 nautical mile trek on low airways. It was the back end of a long Labor Day weekend, a multi-generational plane load of family members who had been enjoying the holiday. The operational manager for Green River Aviation at Keene Airport watched the Baron taxi to the self-service fuel pumps before taking off. He stated that amongst the gaggle of adults were 2 to 3 teenage girls. The NTSB does not comment as to whether these girls were the kids that the pilot had referenced to Burlington Flight Service Station. Once at the pumps, an individual called out gallons as they went on board the aircraft. Another person pumped the fuel into the wings. 6 pounds per gallon. It's actually relatively light for the amount of energy you can extract from it, but it's also the enemy of flight. That's the paradox. Everything gets more difficult the more weight that you pile on, but what's the point of flying if you can't carry payload? They clearly wanted to make Charleston, but with 7 people on board, they needed to count every pound. The NTSB did a lot of soul searching regarding the weight and balance of the aircraft. The way they figured it, the plane was either just within limits or just outside of them. It all came down to how much fuel was already on board the aircraft when they had arrived at the pumps. If weight had been all there was to it, they probably would have survived. The greatest danger in a light twin following an engine failure is slowing below minimum controllable airspeed and spinning the aircraft nose down into the ground. It happens all too often. The pilot of the Baron had just under 1,300 hours of experience with 469 in multi-engine airplanes. It's not an awful lot, but apparently it was enough. All indications are that he maintained control of the aircraft until all hope was lost. He didn't succumb to the tendency to pull back at the cost of critical airspeed, but he had also screwed up. And in the end, it didn't have anything to do with the extra person who was on board. According to a representative of the pilot's family, there had been a problem with the landing gear after takeoff from West Virginia at the beginning of the weekend. Specifically, it appears that the gear wouldn't retract. It appears that the pilot elected to continue to New Hampshire with the issue. Keene isn't a particularly big airport. It was Labor Day weekend. There weren't any mechanics around. Repairs were going to have to wait. It's only 90 miles to Boston. You can get an airline ticket to just about anywhere out of Logan Field. Life would be so much easier if we could live it in hindsight. When the pilot filed his flight plan for the return to West Virginia, the flight service specialist amended a note explaining that the aircraft would be cruising at a lower than normal airspeed to comply with gear limitations. The pilot had explained that he would need to keep the gear extended for the entire flight. The NTSB would blame, in part, this decision for the crash. The airplane handbook lists a rather anemic 230 foot per minute climb rate at max weight following an engine failure. Though the failure of an engine only cuts in half the total amount of power available, it reduces performance by 80%. That's because a good portion of power is needed to simply maintain flying airspeed. Compounding this is the fact that asymmetric thrust causes the airplane to fly crooked through the sky. This increases drag. There's some other reasons too. The big problem, and this is the thing that the NTSB really keyed in on, is that the performance numbers are only applicable if the gear is up. With the gear down, the aircraft does not have enough power to remain in the air. The engine failure apparently occurred between 200 and 300 feet above the ground. The pilot did not have enough altitude to make it back around. The first responder to the crash was a man named Mark who was riding an ATV through the woods. Mark told police that he heard 2 muffled explosions just before the plane hit the ground. He wasn't far away. He made it to the crash site within a minute. The plane was engulfed by flames. Mark watched as the bodies burned. He stated that he was deeply disturbed by the image and was having trouble coping with the horror. Grandparents, adults, teenage girls, all vanishing before his eyes. the third gate of hell in a verdant meadow. Remarkably, in the NTSB's revised analysis, the failure of the right engine was a factor in the crash, not the cause. To understand this, you need to know a little something about the relationship between stakeholders in aviation and accident reports. In the United States, lawsuits are a mechanism through which entities are held accountable for misdeeds. An accident report has two purposes. The primary one is to facilitate safer operating practices. It is reflexive. It's why they say the rules were written in blood. The second purpose is ancillary but important. It serves as fodder for follow-up action in court. Beechcraft sells Barons for only one reason. Prospective buyers prefer the redundancy of a second power plant. If they didn't, they'd buy a Bonanza instead. It's nearly as fast, carries 6 as well, and costs quite a bit less to operate. If this crash had been in a Bonanza instead of a Baron, the detonation of the number 5 cylinder which led to the engine failure would have been the cause of the accident. The decision to take off with landing gear that didn't retract would have been commented on but would not have been a factor. In the Baron, the promise of redundancy was made null by the pilot's decision to operate with a full load without the ability to retract the landing gear. Blame is a fickle thing. In either case, the decision to carry 7 passengers in an aircraft with 6 seats was irrelevant. 130 pounds less wasn't going to keep the aircraft aloft, and an extra seatbelt wasn't going to preserve a life. Once the engine failed and the gear wouldn't retract, their fates were sealed. Perhaps due to crash damage, the NTSB report does not specify the cause of the landing gear malfunction. They were, however, able to sort out what caused the right engine to fail. The number 5 cylinder consisted of a new head which had been installed on a remanufactured barrel. It's the sort of thing that happens to an engine after 2 decades in service. There were only 140 hours in the remanufactured engine on the day of the crash. 12 years after the initial report was published, the NTSB amended it. They don't explain what the changes were, but they appear to be related to the probable cause. For the record, they blame the decision to fly with a no landing gear system deficiency. They also blamed an inadequate manufacturing process which led to the failure of the remanufactured number 5 cylinder. God bless them. Stay safe out there.